There is a building on the west side of Chicago that most people know without knowing it. They know it from Thursday nights, from the sound of a flat line cutting through a crowded emergency room, from George Clooney in Scrubs, from 15 seasons of one of the most watched television dramas in American history, the show ER, which set its fictional hospital inside a place modeled directly on a real institution that stood for over a century on West Harrison Street. But the real building had a story the cameras never fully told. Look at it in its prime, a Beaux-Arts facade stretching 2 full city blocks, limestone columns rising 3 stories, stone lions flanking the entrance, cupids carved into the cornices. From the outside, it had the bearing of a courthouse or a cathedral, something permanent, something that mattered. Inside, it was a different world entirely. For more than 100 years, Cook County Hospital operated as the place Chicago sent the people it had, decided not to care for. The poor and uninsured, black patients turned away from private hospitals across the city, immigrants with no money and no options. The hospital did not absorb these patients out of abundance or generosity. It absorbed them because the city designed a system that required it to, and then declined to give the hospital the resources that system demanded. What followed was a century of breathtaking medical innovation, of genuine heroism, and of sustained, deliberate neglect. It ended with a patient dumping scandal so stark it forced an act of Congress, and then, eventually, with a luxury hotel. This is the story of the real Cook County Hospital, what it gave, what was taken from it, and what its walls will always remember. Chapter 1: Chicago's Explosive Birth and Its First Discarded. In 1832, Chicago was not yet a city. It was barely a settlement, 400 people clustered around a river mouth on the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan, surrounded by prairie in every direction. There was no grid of streets, no industry, nor infrastructure of any kind. What there was potential, and the particular kind of chaos that potential tends to produce. The growth that followed was unlike almost anything in American history. By 1854, 30,000 people called Chicago home. By 1860, 100,000. By 1890, the number had crossed 1 million, making Chicago the second largest city in the United States in less than 60 years. People arrived by the thousands every month. German and Irish immigrants first, then Poles, Italians, Czechs, Lithuanians, streaming off boats and trains with little money, few connections, and bodies worn down by the crossing. And with that many people packed that quickly, into a place with no modern sanitation, no clean water infrastructure, and no real public health system, disease was not a possibility. It was a certainty. Cholera arrived in 1849. The city had no meaningful way to respond. What existed were a handful of wooden shacks thrown up on the edge of the settlement to quarantine the sick. Not to treat them, not to save them, but to keep them separated from those who might still survive. When those structures proved inadequate, the city improvised. Warehouses were pressed into service as hospitals. Church halls became wards. The distinction between a place of healing and a place to die was often theoretical. The epidemic returned in 1854, worse than before. The wooden quarantine structure from the first outbreak had already burned down. The city rebuilt, again improvising, again falling short. Through all of this, a foundational question was being answered, not through debate or deliberate policy, but through the accumulated weight of small decisions made by people who would rather not think too hard about it. Who was responsible for the sick poor? The answer, written into Northwest Territory law and confirmed by the Illinois General Assembly, was the counties, not private citizens, charities, or the market. Care of paupers was a government obligation, assigned by statute, which meant that from the very beginning, the medical care of Chicago's most vulnerable residents was designed to exist in a separate category from the medical care of everyone else. This was not accidental, it was architecture. In 1857, Chicago built its first permanent hospital, a 3-story brick and limestone structure at 18th and Arnold Streets. Rush Medical School used the building as a teaching facility, which meant that from its first day of operation, the institution served 2 masters simultaneously. It was a civic obligation and an educational resource. The poor, received care. The physicians received patients. The arrangement suited everyone except perhaps the patients, whose dignity was rarely the primary concern in either calculation. Then the Civil War came. The building at 18th and Arnold Streets was converted into an army hospital, swallowed by the machinery of a conflict that consumed everything it touched. When the war ended, the city traded the hospital back to Cook County in exchange for 160 acres of land that had been used as a reform school. In 1866, the institution reopened under the name the Old County Hospital. The trade had been made. The purpose had been set. This was now, officially and permanently, the place Cook County sent the people it was legally required to care for. That same year, 1866, the hospital launched something genuinely remarkable, the first formal internship program in American medical history. Young physicians chosen through competitive examination, unpaid, gained clinical experience at a volume and variety they could not have found anywhere else in the country. It was a place where ambition and desperation inhabited the same hallways, often in the same person, but ambition and desperation were not all that inhabited those hallways. Political corruption moved in almost immediately. Hospital purchasing and personnel decisions fell under the control of patronage appointees, people whose primary qualifications were their connections to the right aldermen and commissioners. The physical plant deteriorated. Rats and roaches became fixtures. The building filled beyond its capacity as Chicago's population kept rising and the tide of newcomers kept breaking against its doors. The city was growing faster than it had any idea how to govern, and the people at the bottom of that growth had exactly one place to go. Chapter 2. The Golden Age of Grime. By the late 1870s, Cook County Hospital had settled into a rhythm that would define it for generations, a rhythm of genuine brilliance and institutional rot, playing out simultaneously, in the same building, sometimes in the same room. The corruption had grown comfortable. Patronage appointments filled the staff roles with men whose primary qualification was their relationship to the right politician. After almost the entire medical staff resigned in protest over the situation, in the years surrounding the 1876 expansion, the politicians responded not by reforming the system, but by replacing the staff with more compliant and considerably less qualified physicians. By 1886, newspaper articles were describing Cook County Hospital as a roadhouse for politicians. The building was newer. The problem was older than the building. And then Christian Fenger arrived. He came to Chicago in 1878 by way of a journey that, depending on who was telling the story, bordered on the mythological. Fenger was Danish, trained in Copenhagen, seasoned in the surgical theaters of Europe, and shaped by his experience as a military surgeon in 2 wars before he had turned 35. Unable to secure the professorship in Denmark that his abilities warranted, he had gone to work in Egypt, serving the Khedive for several years, studying tropical diseases, performing thousands of procedures, and immersing himself in a medical culture as foreign to him as the climate. Those who knew Fenger in later years told a story about his time in Cairo, that he had played a role in helping stage Verdi's opera, Aida, at the Khedivial Opera House in 1871, and that in gratitude, the Khedive had presented him with a mummy, which he subsequently sold in Chicago to fund his appointment to the county hospital staff. Whether every detail of that story survived the journey intact is impossible to say with certainty. But it captures something essential about Christian Fenger, that he was a man who moved through the world by extraordinary means, who arrived in unlikely places and left them permanently changed. What is certain is that he paid $1,000 for his position at Cook County Hospital, a sum that tells you everything about how the institution operated in that era, and nothing about what he was about to do to it. Fenger did not assimilate to the culture of the place. He dismantled it and rebuilt it according to his own standards. He trained interns with a rigor and a depth that had not existed at the hospital before him, drawing on European methods that most American physicians had never encountered. He performed surgeries that his colleagues considered impossible. He worked in multiple languages, reading medical literature from across the continent to stay current with a field that was transforming faster than most institutions could follow. His residents and interns went on to become leaders of American medicine, men who carried the standards Fenger had imposed on them into every institution they subsequently touched. He did all of this inside a building where the wards held 50 to 70 patients in a single open room, with no curtains for privacy and no air conditioning during the suffocating Chicago summers. Flies moved freely through the operating rooms. Nurses kept fly swatters on hand, not as a joke, but as a practical necessity. Dignity was rationed as carefully as medicine, and often more sparingly. The paradox of Cook County Hospital in this period was not subtle. You could read in the morning paper that the institution was a monument to political patronage and civic negligence, then walk through its doors and watch Christian Fenger perform a surgery that no one else in the country could replicate. Both things were true. The corruption and the excellence fed on each other in ways that neither could entirely explain. Fenger was followed as the hospital's pathologist in 1895 by Ludwig Hechtoen, a scientist whose contributions to the young discipline of immunology would reverberate through medicine for decades. Not long after, a physician named James B. Herrick produced at Cook County the first clinical descriptions of sickle cell anemia and coronary thrombosis, work that would eventually reshape how medicine understood the heart and the blood. These were not minor contributions. They were foundational discoveries made inside a building that the city's politicians treated as a dumping ground for its least desirable obligations. The early 1900s brought the first meaningful structural reform. New civil service laws required that attending physicians pass a formal examination before receiving a staff appointment, a change that, almost immediately, transformed the character of the volunteer staff. The best surgeons and physicians in Chicago began showing up at Cook County not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Appointment to the staff had become, improbably, an honor, a mark of professional standing, a way of keeping one's skills sharp on the most demanding and varied clinical population in the city. For a brief and luminous period, the system worked almost as it was supposed to. It would not last. It never did. But, for a moment, standing at the threshold of the 20th century, Cook County Hospital looked something like what it had always claimed to be. Chapter 3. The House the City Built for Its Unwanted. In 1916, Chicago built Cook County Hospital a new home. From the outside, it was astonishing. A Beaux-Arts classical structure stretching 2 full city blocks along West Harrison Street, 8 stories of limestone and terracotta, monumental columns rising from the street-level facade, stone figures of lions and cupids worked into the cornices, every surface speaking the language of civic permanence and institutional pride. It cost $3.5 million to construct, a sum that translates to roughly $590 million in today's money. It was, without question, the grandest public hospital in the Midwest and one of the most architecturally imposing medical facilities anywhere in the country. Stand back far enough, and it looked like a palace. That was, in a sense, the point, and also the cruelest irony the building contained, because the people who would fill those wards were not the people for whom palaces were built. The magnificence of the facade was not a reflection of how Chicago valued the patients inside. It was a reflection of how Chicago valued the idea of itself, of a city modern enough, prosperous enough, and responsible enough to maintain a great public hospital. The building announced civic virtue. What happened inside it was a different calculation entirely. The immigrant waves that had been breaking against Cook County's doors since the 1860s had not slowed. If anything, they had intensified. Polish and Italian and Czech and Lithuanian families arrived in Chicago by the hundreds of thousands in the decades surrounding the turn of the century. Many of them desperately poor, many of them sick from the crossing or from the conditions of their first years in the city. They came to County because County was where you came when you had nowhere else to go. The hospital became, in the words of those who later tried to describe it, something like Chicago's Ellis Island, a place that absorbed the human cost of the city's growth and asked for nothing in return except that the patients be willing to accept care without privacy, without comfort, and without complaint. Then, beginning in the 1910s, something shifted. The Great Migration was underway. African Americans from the Deep South were arriving in Chicago in enormous numbers, drawn by the promise of industrial work and the relative freedom of a northern city. By the 1920s, Chicago's black population had grown dramatically, and the city's private hospitals had made their position clear. Black patients were largely excluded from private medical facilities across Chicago. The exclusion was not always written into explicit policy. It did not need to be. It operated through admission practices, through referral patterns, through the quiet, efficient machinery of institutional racism that did not require a sign on the door to communicate its meaning. Cook County Hospital accepted everyone. Not because the politicians who controlled its budget had decided that racial equality was a priority. Cook County accepted everyone because it had always been the place designed to receive whoever the rest of the system refused. The black patients who turned to County in the 1910s and 1920s did not arrive there as the beneficiaries of enlightened policy. They arrived there because every other door had been closed. This is the mechanism that the city had constructed, and it is important to name it precisely. Chicago maintained a two-tiered medical system, and Cook County Hospital was not the failure of that system. It was the system working exactly as designed. And yet, inside those walls, remarkable things kept happening. In the 1930s, a physician named Dr. Bernard Fantis accomplished something that had never been done anywhere in the world. He developed techniques to preserve blood outside the human body long enough to store it for future use. And in doing so, he created and opened the world's first blood bank at Cook County Hospital in a building where interns still sometimes ran short of soap. The irony was almost too large to hold. A global medical first, achieved at an institution the city treated as an afterthought. From the 1920s through the Second World War, Cook County Hospital was genuinely regarded as one of the world's great teaching hospitals. Physicians came from other countries to walk its wards, to see diseases in their full and varied presentations, to witness surgical techniques they had read about but never observed, to train alongside residents who had developed a toughness and a clinical fluency that only a hospital of this volume and this variety could produce. The institution had a reputation that extended far beyond Chicago, far beyond Illinois, into the international medical community. That reputation coexisted, without apparent embarrassment, with conditions that defied description. Interns in this era shared a single syringe between patients, sterilizing it between uses, or sometimes not. When a patient needed an X-ray, interns would write fictitious names in the appointment book to hold time slots, then substitute the real patient's name when the moment came and push them on carts through long underground tunnels that connected the hospital's buildings beneath the street. When a patient needed blood, the intern went to the family and made the case personally because the system for securing transfusions required a human donation arranged on the spot. Needles, intravenous tubing, and blood culture bottles ran short. At various points, even soap and towels were rationed. The greatest public hospital in the Midwest, the world's first blood bank, and not enough soap. This was Cook County Hospital at its peak, a place of genuine, world-class medicine, operating inside a structure of deliberate, systemic neglect. The city had built it a magnificent house. It had simply chosen not to furnish the rooms. Chapter 4. Where the city sent its most desperate. If the hospital had a soul, it lived in the emergency room. Every other department at Cook County could, in theory, manage its intake, could schedule, could defer, could make decisions about who arrived and when and under what circumstances. The emergency room could not. The emergency room took whoever came through the door, at whatever hour, in whatever condition, without negotiation and without exception. It was the one place in the building where the hospital's foundational promise was tested in real time, every hour of every day, and it was tested constantly. The environment of the old Cook County emergency room was not what television later made it look like. There were no clean corridors and dramatic lighting, and the kind of controlled chaos that resolves itself neatly within the hour. What there was volume, a relentless, grinding, unglamorous volume that the staff absorbed because absorbing it was the only available option. Patients waited for hours in overcrowded rooms. Admissions to the wards often happened only in the early hours of the morning, when beds had finally turned over from the previous day. New arrivals were placed in beds set in the middle rows of open wards, or inside side rooms, with medical students and interns as their first point of contact. The interns carried blood samples across the hospital grounds by hand, walking them to the laboratory because there was no other system. The system was so comprehensively broken that the workarounds had calcified into institutional knowledge, passed from one generation of interns to the next as carefully as any clinical technique. And then, in 1966, something happened inside this broken system that changed American medicine permanently. It happened, characteristically, in a space that had not been designed for the purpose. An unused dining room was cleared out, repurposed, and transformed into the first comprehensive trauma unit ever established in the United States, the brainchild of two Cook County physicians, Dr. Robert Freark and Dr. Robert Baker. Their inspiration had come from specialty hospitals in Austria, facilities positioned at strategic intervals along motorways to treat the victims of automobile accidents using techniques that had been refined in combat zones and mass casualty events. What Freark and Baker created at County took those principles and formalized them into something new, a dedicated surgical, medical, and nursing team with specialized training assembled in a designated space, available around the clock to treat the most critical cases the city could produce. Before this moment, there was no such thing in American medicine. Trauma patients arrived at whichever hospital was closest and received whatever care that hospital happened to be equipped to provide. The outcome depended largely on geography and luck. After 1966, there was a model that would eventually define how emergency trauma care was delivered across the entire country. Through the 1970s, under the leadership of Dr. John Barrett, the trauma unit grew into a national institution. The model that Cook County had pioneered spread to other hospitals, and the unit's influence shaped the creation of local and then state emergency medical services systems. In 1987, the unit formalized its legacy further with the establishment of the first dedicated clinical trauma fellowship in the United States, creating a structured pathway for training the next generation of trauma surgeons to the standards that County had spent 2 decades developing. In 1996, Princess Diana visited. She came to the AIDS ward and the trauma center, a visit that generated the kind of global press attention that the hospital's own century of innovation had never managed to produce. For one brief news cycle, the world looked at Cook County Hospital and saw what the people who worked there had always known was there. Then the cameras moved on. What they left behind and what they had always found when they arrived was the same thing. A demographic record of Chicago's underclass, written in patient intake forms across more than 100 years. In the early decades, it was the European immigrants who filled the wards and the waiting room. Then, as the Great Migration reshaped the city, the patient population shifted, and Cook County became one of the primary medical destinations for Black Chicagoans excluded from private care across the city. By the 1960s, the emergency room was seeing the consequences of alcoholic cirrhosis and severe hypertension at a scale that physicians elsewhere rarely encountered. Through the 70s and into the 80s, heroin and cocaine arrived, and with them, a new set of crises that the staff absorbed the same way they had absorbed every previous crisis, without adequate resources, without political support, and without the option of turning anyone away. In the late 1990s, the AIDS epidemic reached the emergency room in force. Cook County established one of the earliest clinics in the country for treating patients with HIV. By the 2000s, Hispanic patients made up nearly half the patient population. The names changed, the faces changed, the languages in the waiting room changed. What did not change was the fundamental dynamic. Cook County's emergency room was the place Chicago sent the people it had decided, in each successive era, that it did not want to be responsible for. The institution received them. It cared for them, imperfectly, heroically, and chronically, without enough of anything except the work itself. That was the bargain the city had made, and it was a bargain the city never renegotiated. Chapter 5. What the cameras saw and what they didn't. In 1974, a young physician named Michael Crichton sat down and wrote a screenplay. He had graduated from Harvard Medical School 5 years earlier, in 1969, and during his clinical rotations at Boston City Hospital, he had encountered the emergency room not as a dramatic backdrop, but as a system, chaotic, overcrowded, morally exhausting, and shot through with a kind of unglamorous heroism that he had never seen reflected anywhere in popular culture. He wanted to put it on screen exactly as he had experienced it. The pace, the noise, the impossible decisions made in seconds, the way human suffering arrived without appointment and without narrative tidiness. He called the screenplay EW for Emergency Ward. He shopped it to producers. Nobody was interested. Crichton set it aside and turned to other things: novels, films, eventually a book about dinosaurs that would become the most commercially successful science fiction property of its generation. The screenplay sat in a drawer for 20 years. In 1993, Steven Spielberg called Crichton about a new project. Both men had been thinking about the emergency room script. Spielberg had the instinct that it belonged on television rather than film, that the setting was too rich, and the stories too numerous to be compressed into 2 hours. He attached his production company and took the project to NBC. NBC was not immediately convinced. The network had been burned before by medical dramas and was uncertain whether audiences had the appetite for something this clinical and this unromantic about the practice of medicine. They debated, hesitated, but eventually they ordered a pilot. The script used to shoot the pilot was the same script Crichton had written in 1974. The screenplay had not required meaningful revision. What Crichton had observed and recorded at Boston City Hospital was, it turned out, essentially still true. The show was set at a fictional institution called Cook County General Hospital, a name chosen deliberately to evoke the real Cook County Hospital on West Harrison Street in Chicago. The connection was not incidental. The fictional hospital was designed to inhabit the same moral and physical universe as the real one. A public hospital in a major American city, legally obligated to treat everyone who arrived, perpetually short of the resources that obligation demanded. The production took the reference seriously. Juliana Margulies, who played Nurse Carol Hathaway in the series, spent time shadowing the actual emergency room nurses at the real Cook County Hospital before filming began. She later noted that the 1970s aesthetic of the set, the worn surfaces, the institutional colors, the sense of a building that had been functional for a very long time without ever being updated, closely resembled the actual appearance of the hospital she had walked through. What the show captured was the texture of the work, the volume of cases, the way decisions compounded on each other without pause for reflection, the hierarchy of interns and residents and attendings that structured every interaction, the patient population that reflected the demographic reality of a safety net hospital serving the people that every other institution in the city had declined to serve. In these respects, ER was more honest about the American emergency room than anything that had come before it on American television. But there were things the camera softened. The physical condition of the real building was considerably worse than anything the set designers chose to depict, not for dramatic effect, but because the actual deterioration of Cook County's infrastructure was the kind of detail that reads as exaggeration on screen, even when it is documentary fact. The true depth of the staffing shortages, the genuine scarcity of basic supplies, the degree to which the hospital operated through the improvised workarounds of exhausted people rather than through any functioning system. These realities were present in the show's DNA, but diluted to the level that a primetime drama audience could absorb without the fiction collapsing into something unwatchable. And the show's deepest evasion was structural. In ER, the antagonists were human, difficult administrators, flawed physicians, patients whose circumstances created impossible situations. The drama lived in individual moral choices. What the show could not dramatize, because it does not make for compelling television, was the real villain of Cook County Hospital's story, not a person, but a policy, not a character, but a system. The city of Chicago, decade after decade, making the deliberate choice to maintain 2 tiers of medical care and to let Cook County absorb the consequences of that choice without the funding or the political will to address it. ER ran for 15 seasons. At its peak, it drew nearly 50 million viewers in a single episode, more people than watched most presidential addresses. It won more Emmy nominations than any drama in television history. It made Cook County General Hospital one of the most recognized fictional institutions in the world. And while it aired, the real Cook County Hospital continued to receive, on a daily basis, exactly the patients the show depicted. The show was beloved. The hospital was taken for granted. In the end, that contrast may be the most accurate thing ER ever captured about the place it was based on. not in what it showed, but in what it revealed by omission. Chapter 6. The scandals, the strikes, and the slow unraveling. The war ended, and Cook County Hospital began to come apart. Not all at once, not dramatically. The unraveling of the institution in the decades following the Second World War happened the way most institutional failures happen, gradually, through accumulation, through a series of small decisions made by people who had calculated that the consequences would land somewhere other than on themselves. The voluntary attending physicians who had given the hospital its clinical reputation began to leave. Chicago's medical schools were building their own teaching hospitals, modern facilities with updated equipment and manageable patient loads, where the conditions of practice were closer to what a physician might reasonably expect. Private hospitals were expanding. The ecosystem that had made Cook County uniquely valuable as a training ground was being replicated in more comfortable form elsewhere in the city. What remained at County was the obligation, the legal requirement to receive everyone, the patient population that no other institution wanted, the building that had been magnificent in 1916 and had been aging without adequate maintenance ever since, and a nursing shortage so severe and intern pay so poor that the basic mechanics of running a functioning hospital were becoming difficult to sustain. This was the inheritance that a new generation of physicians walked into in the 1960s. The pattern of exposure and minimal reform that had characterized Cook County's relationship with the public for decades had deep roots. As far back as 1905, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle had touched the edges of Cook County's world in its portrait of Chicago's institutional failures, the gap between the city's self-image and the reality experienced by its poorest residents. The book had caused outrage. The outrage had produced some reform. The reform had faded. The gap had remained. This cycle would repeat itself at Cook County with such regularity that it began to look less like a series of crises and more like a feature of the institution's design. In 1971, 4 physicians were dismissed from the hospital staff. The reasons were disputed. What was not disputed was the response. A massive exodus of staff followed as physicians and residents who had watched the situation deteriorate decided that the institution's leadership could no longer be trusted. The hospital's very survival came into serious question. The people who depended on it were not consulted about whether the crisis was convenient for them. The state legislature had attempted to address the underlying political problem 2 years earlier, in 1969, by assigning governance of the hospital to a citizens' commission, a structural reform designed to reduce the influence of the Cook County political machine over an institution whose patients were paying the price of that influence in delayed care and deteriorating conditions. The reform lasted as long as it took the Cook County Board of Commissioners to reassert itself. The board retained control of the budget, which meant it retained control of everything that mattered, and in 1979, it reclaimed complete administrative authority over the hospital, returning the institution to the same political orbit it had occupied since its founding. In 1975, the interns and residents went on strike. The hospital closed. Not partially, not in some departments. The institution shut its doors because the people doing the most essential work inside it had reached the limit of what they were willing to absorb without response. The strike ended. The hospital reopened. The conditions that had produced the strike were addressed incompletely and temporarily, as they always had been. Through all of this, the stories accumulated. Stories circulated through the wards at Cook County and were passed down through generations of staff with the solemn reliability of oral tradition. The hospital superintendent was said to walk his dogs through the surgical suites. Parties were allegedly held with surgical nurses in a penthouse atop the main building. Interns caught smoking were reportedly forbidden from using the hospital elevators for weeks at a stretch. Whether every detail of every story survived its retelling intact is impossible to verify. But the stories persisted because they captured something. The texture of an institution that had been asked to do too much for too long with too little, and had developed its own internal culture as a way of making that sustainable. Meanwhile, the building itself was losing the argument with time. The magnificent Beaux-Arts structure that had announced Chicago's civic ambition in 1916 was, by the 1970s and 80s, in serious physical distress. Ceilings collapsed. Lead paint curled from the walls. the infrastructure that supported the daily operation of a 3,000-bed hospital, aged without the maintenance budget required to slow its deterioration. Preservation organizations had begun to take notice of the building's architectural significance, adding the complexity of landmark status to an institution already struggling to justify its continued existence to the politicians who controlled its funding. The building was on the National Register of Historic Places. It was also falling apart. Both of those things were true. At Cook County Hospital, both things were always true. Chapter 7. The Patient Dumping Scandal. For most of Cook County Hospital's history, the arrangement was understood without being stated. Private hospitals in Chicago turned away patients who could not pay. They declined to admit black patients, or admitted them under conditions designed to discourage return. They transferred the inconvenient, the uninsured, the expensive, and the dying to the one institution in the city that could not say no. Cook County received them. The city allocated a budget that acknowledged none of this. The politicians said nothing. The private hospitals said nothing. The patients, who rarely survived the experience with the energy required to make formal complaint, said nothing that anyone recorded. Dr. David Ansell and Dr. Robert Schiff were not the first people to notice what was happening at the doors of Cook County's emergency room. They were, however, among the first to document it with the systematic rigor that transforms a widely understood practice into an undeniable public fact. Their research gave the arrangement its name, patient dumping. They defined it precisely: the denial of or limitation in the provision of medical services to a patient for economic reasons, and the referral of that patient elsewhere. The word dumping was not chosen for its neutrality. The numbers that Ansell and Schiff put into the medical literature were not surprising, but they were impossible to dismiss. 87% of patients transferred to Cook County from private hospitals across the city had been transferred for a single stated reason: no insurance. Only 6% of those patients had given written informed consent for their transfer, meaning that the overwhelming majority had been moved without meaningful agreement, in some cases without their knowledge, in some cases while they were too sick to be asked. 24% were transferred in medically unstable condition, and patients who were dumped, who were loaded into ambulances and sent across town rather than being treated where they had first arrived, were twice as likely to die as patients who received care at the hospital where they initially sought it. The racial dimension of the data was equally explicit. 89% of the patients being dumped on Cook County were minorities. 87% were unemployed. The system that everyone had always understood to be operating was not, it turned out, a neutral economic mechanism. Private hospitals were placing patients into vehicles and sending them to Cook County. Patient dumping transfers in Chicago alone had risen from approximately 1,295 per year in 1980 to 5,652 per year by 1984. The number had more than quadrupled in 4 years. The professional and popular press took up the story. The combination of documented evidence, human testimony, and the obvious inadequacy of existing law produced, for once, a legislative response that moved with relative speed. In April of 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, known by its initials as EMTALA, and referred to in the years that followed as the Patient Anti-Dumping Law. It was 4 pages of federal statute. It required every hospital with an emergency department that received Medicare funding, which was to say, essentially every hospital in the United States, to screen any patient who presented for emergency care and to stabilize any patient found to have an emergency medical condition, regardless of their insurance status or their ability to pay. Transfer was permitted only under specific conditions, with patient consent, and only to a facility equipped to provide the necessary care. The law was the most direct legislative consequence in American history of what had been documented and endured at Cook County Hospital. It had taken a century of the arrangement and 2 physicians willing to count the bodies to produce it. The coda was painful. Ansell and Schiff themselves, in the immediate aftermath of EMTALA's passage, noted publicly that the law's vague definitions of emergency care and patient stabilization would hamper its monitoring and enforcement. They were right. Violations continued. Hospitals found the edges of the statute and operated along them. the practice of patient dumping did not end with the law. It adapted to it, became more sophisticated, learned the language of compliance while preserving the economics of exclusion. The system had been named. It had not been dismantled. Cook County Hospital went on receiving, as it always had, the patients that the named and partially regulated system continued to produce. Chapter 8. The Closing and the Conversion. In December of 2002, Cook County Hospital closed its doors, not in crisis, not in scandal, not because a strike had forced the issue or a politician had finally lost patience. It closed because a new building had been finished, a modern facility constructed on adjacent land. The new hospital was named for John H. Stroger, Jr., the then president of the Cook County Board, in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously appropriate and tone-deaf, honoring a politician with the name of an institution that had survived, in large part, by enduring the consequences of political decisions. Before the transition was complete, the city said goodbye. It was not a quiet farewell. A massive open-air gathering assembled outside the old building, former patients who had been born within its walls, nurses who had spent careers on its wards, physicians who had trained there and never entirely left, residents who had absorbed its rhythms so deeply that the hospital had become part of how they understood themselves. Generations of Chicago compressed into an afternoon on West Harrison Street, standing in front of a building that had received them, or their parents or their grandparents, at the moments when they had nowhere else to go. Some wept. Some simply stood and looked. The building that had never been sentimental about anything received this final attention with the same impassive limestone face it had always presented to the street. Then the doors closed, and the building waited for nearly 2 decades. The terracotta facade that had been meticulously crafted in 1916 began to crumble. Chunks fell. The interior, no longer climate-controlled or maintained, deteriorated. Ceilings collapsed, lead paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. The elaborate terrazzo flooring cracked. The intricate interior moldings accumulated damage that would have been inexpensive to prevent, and became extraordinarily expensive to repair. Preservationists and historians argued for the building's salvation. The architectural and historical significance of the structure was not in dispute. It had been placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2006, a designation that protected it from demolition, but did not by itself provide a path forward and the political approvals to redevelop the old Cook County Hospital building as a mixed-use property anchored by a hotel. The project, valued at between $140 and $150 million, would be led by Murphy Development Group and the Walsh Group, with architecture by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, one of the most prestigious firms in the country. The exterior would be restored, the more than 4,000 pieces of damaged terracotta repaired or replicated by one of the only 2 manufacturers of such material still operating in the United States. The interior would be gutted and rebuilt for an entirely new purpose. In July of 2020, the Hyatt Place and Hyatt House Chicago Medical and University District officially opened inside the former Cook County Hospital at 1835 West Harrison Street. 210 rooms, a fitness center, 4,000 square feet of event space, a food hall on the ground floor named Dr. Murphy's Food Hall, in honor of the celebrated 19th century surgeon John Benjamin Murphy, who had trained and practiced within those walls. A small museum tucked into the development, dedicated to the hospital's legacy. The hallways where interns had pushed patients on carts through the pre-dawn hours now led to hotel rooms. The wards where 50 patients had lain in open rows, separated by no curtain and no privacy, had been divided into individual suites with real kitchens and climate control. The surgical theaters had been converted into hotel accommodations, their observation galleries still visible, their history now available as an amenity. And across the street, in the modern facility that had replaced it, Stroger Hospital continued to operate. Smaller than its predecessor, more efficiently designed, equipped with contemporary medical technology, and underfunded in the same ways for the same reasons, serving the same populations that Cook County had always served. The people that the rest of Chicago's medical system continued, in its various updated and partially regulated ways, to decline to absorb. The museum in the hotel lobby honored the legacy. The plaques acknowledge the history. The food hall was named for a surgeon. History in Chicago is most comfortable when it has been converted into something useful for people who can afford to use it. Chapter 9: The City's Oldest Bargain. Here is what Cook County Hospital was not. It was not a failure. It was not a cautionary tale about the limits of public medicine, or evidence that safety net institutions are structurally incapable of excellence. The people who worked there were not failing. They were succeeding repeatedly and remarkably against conditions that were not accidental. The conditions were the point. Cook County Hospital was the mechanism that allowed every other institution in Chicago to function without having to reckon with the full cost of what it was refusing to do. Private hospitals could maintain their admission standards, their financial models, their racial exclusions, their careful management of which patients were worth treating. Because Cook County existed to absorb the consequences, the hospital was not a safety net in the sense of a last resort that everyone hoped would rarely be needed. It was a load-bearing wall. What emerged from that arrangement, despite everything, was a medical legacy that reshapes how Americans receive care to this day. The building that produced all of this is a hotel now. Its facade has been restored with extraordinary care. Guests walk hallways that once held the dying. They sleep in rooms that were once wards. The surgical theaters, preserved intact, are available as distinctive accommodations for travelers who find that kind of history atmospheric. The bargain has not changed. Only the building has.